It all began on a sunny afternoon in a neighborhood where everything looked picture perfect: trimmed lawns, freshly painted fences, and neighbors who smiled only when it was convenient. But beneath the surface of calm, tension often lived quietly, waiting for the wrong moment to show itself. On this day, that moment arrived. A young boy spotted a man across the street, unloading heavy grocery bags from his car. Instead of curiosity or kindness, the boy felt something else, an expectation that the world should bend for him. With little thought, he marched over and demanded the bags as if they were his own. The man, dressed neatly, his expression calm, explained politely that the groceries belonged to him. But the boy, used to always getting what he wanted, raised his voice and shouted for his mother. And that is when the air in the neighborhood shifted. She came quickly, with the kind of authority only she believed in. Her voice cut across the street before her feet even reached the curb. Without asking what happened, without listening to either side, she decided her son was right, and the man was wrong. Her eyes narrowed, and in that instant she created a story that had no truth, painting herself as the protector, and him as the threat. She reached for her phone, convinced she was in control, unaware that the truth was about to unravel in ways she could never have expected. The boy clung to his mother's side as though victory was already his. She wrapped an arm around him, standing tall and certain, dialing the numbers she had dialed before. Her voice grew sharp as she spoke into the phone, painting a picture of danger, of a stranger threatening her family. Around them, the neighborhood seemed to pause. Curtains shifted, blinds bent slightly, and curious eyes peeked through the safety of glass. Whispers began to ripple quietly, questions, doubts, and murmurs that carried further than she imagined. The man, however, did not move. His hands rested calmly on the groceries he had just placed down. There was no fear in his face, no anger either, just a stillness that seemed to unsettle her more than if he had shouted back. His silence held power, a kind of quiet patience that spoke louder than her accusations. Every second that passed seemed to make her more determined, more convinced she was right, as though loudness could build a truth where none existed. Her son watched with eyes wide, believing that his mother's words would always carry more weight than reality. Yet the man's steady gaze met his, not with judgment, but with a firm, unshaken strength. In that moment, it was as if the boy sensed something he couldn't explain, a presence that was larger than the argument itself. And then, far in the distance, came the sound that changed everything, the rising wail of sirens. The neighborhood drew in a breath, waiting to see what would unfold when the uniforms arrived. The sound of sirens grew louder, echoing through the quiet streets until flashing lights painted the corners of houses in red and blue. The mother straightened her shoulders, relief washing over her face as though victory was only moments away. She waved at the approaching vehicles, calling out as if she were the one in command. Her son grinned beside her, certain the men would soon be forced to surrender the groceries that never belonged to him. To them, the arrival of the police meant the end of the story. But for the men who stood calmly in the center of it all, it was only the beginning. Neighbors stepped further outside now, unable to resist the pull of unfolding drama. Some crossed their arms, others whispered to one another, but most stayed silent, waiting to see whether truth or assumption would rule the day. The mother spoke louder, rehearsing her version of events for everyone to hear. "He scared my child. He threatened us," she declared, her voice trembling with a performance that only deepened her conviction. But while her words painted him as dangerous, his posture remained unshaken, calm, steady, and strangely assured. The squad cars pulled to a stop. Doors opened, and officers stepped out. Instead of rushing toward the mother or questioning the men, their eyes shifted immediately to him. Recognition flickered across their faces, followed quickly by respect. And then, to the shock of everyone watching, the officers raised their hands, not in defense, but in salute. The mother froze, her confident smile faltering as the officers stood tall, their eyes fixed not on her, but on the men she had accused. The salute was crisp, filled with a respect that made the crowd whisper louder. She blinked, confusion washing over her features. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice high and sharp, but no one answered her. Instead, all attention seemed to shift toward the men who had remained calm through it all. Slowly, he stepped forward, his steady presence commanding silence across the entire street. He spoke at last, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "Good afternoon, officers," he said, and with those words the truth spilled out like sunlight breaking through a storm. This wasn't just a neighbor with groceries. He was their police commander, the very leader these officers served under. Gasps rippled through the crowd as realization spread. The man she had tried to paint as a threat was, in fact, the highest authority among them. The mother's face drained of color. Her son's smirk faded, replaced by a nervous glance between his mother and the commander. The weight of their mistake pressed down heavier than the stares of the neighbors surrounding them. And yet, the commander did not raise his voice, nor did he humiliate them. Instead, his silence lingered just long enough for the lesson to settle in. The story she had spun so confidently had already unraveled, and nothing she could say would stitch it back together. The crowd stood frozen, caught between disbelief and quiet satisfaction. Some neighbors exchanged knowing looks, while others simply shook their heads at the mother's crumbling act. She tried to recover, her voice trembling yet still clinging to pride. I was only protecting my child, she insisted, her words meant to sound noble but falling flat against the truth everyone now saw. Her excuse echoed weakly, unable to hide the cracks forming in her authority. The commander finally turned his eyes to her, steady and unwavering. Protecting him, he repeated softly, almost as if weighing the words. Then he shifted his gaze to the boy, who now shuffled uneasily under the weight of the moment. The commander's tone held no anger, only firm clarity. Protection doesn't mean taking what isn't yours. It doesn't mean accusing others without reason. Respect, honesty, those are the lessons that protect him, not fear. The boy lowered his eyes, for the first time uncertain of the truth his mother had always built for him. Around them, the neighbors leaned in, sensing that this moment carried more than correction, it carried a lesson that reached beyond one family. The silence that followed was heavier than any punishment, heavier even than the flashing lights that still bathed the street. For the mother, it was no longer about defending her pride. It was about realizing the story she had crafted had shattered, and her son had heard every word. Her cheeks flushed crimson as the commander's words echoed through the quiet street. She opened her mouth to argue, to insist she had been right, but nothing came out. The truth hung too heavy in the air, undeniable and sharp. For once, her authority, the force she wielded over neighbors and rules, had no ground to stand on. She tugged her son closer, but even he seemed different now, his wide eyes fixed on the men his mother had tried to shame. The commander looked not at her, but at the boy. His voice softened, carrying weight without harshness. One day, you'll remember this moment, he said. You'll remember that respect is something you give, not something you demand. And you'll remember that people are not measured by what others assume, but by who they truly are. His words struck deeper than anger ever could, settling into the boy's heart like a quiet seed of truth. The neighbors, who had once hidden behind blinds, now stood openly in the street. Their silence wasn't judgmental, it was reflective. They had all witnessed the cost of pride, the danger of assumptions, and the strength of calm dignity. The mother shifted uncomfortably under their stares, realizing she was no longer the center of control, but the center of a painful lesson. And yet, the commander's restraint spared her the humiliation she feared most. His patience, his dignity, spoke louder than any accusation ever could. As the flashing lights dimmed and the officers prepared to leave, the neighborhood felt different, quieter, heavier, but somehow clearer. The commander didn't linger on the accusation or the insult, instead, he turned his attention to everyone present. His voice carried across the street, steady and resolute. Every neighbor deserves dignity, he said. We cannot build trust by assuming the worst of each other. Communities grow stronger not through fear, but through respect. His words weren't just for the mother. They were for everyone listening, a reminder that what happened here could happen anywhere. The mother pulled her son close and turned toward her home, her steps unsteady, her pride fractured. She didn't argue anymore. She couldn't. The boy glanced back one last time at the men his mother had accused, his young face caught between confusion and the weight of a lesson he would never forget. For the first time, he understood that truth was stronger than entitlement, and respect was greater than demands. The neighbors slowly dispersed, carrying the story with them, whispers turning into reflections they would share behind closed doors. And when the commander finally gathered his groceries and walked inside, he did so with the quiet strength of a man who needed no defense, because truth had spoken for him. The street returned to silence, but the echo of what had happened lingered, a story etched into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. A story about pride, respect, and the power of calm dignity. Days passed, but the memory of that afternoon did not fade from the neighborhood. Conversations carried in whispers at first, then in open talks between neighbors who had seen everything. Some admitted they had once shared the same assumptions as the mother, quick to judge without knowing, but after witnessing the truth revealed in such a powerful way, they found themselves questioning their own quiet biases. What lingered was not the embarrassment of one woman, but the reminder that dignity and respect could never be ignored again. The boy, once proud of every demand granted to him, now looked at the world differently. He remembered the calm strength of the commander, the patience, the honesty, and realized that true authority came not from shouting louder, but from standing firmly in truth. Though he was young, the moment reshaped him, planting seeds of humility and respect that would grow with time. As for the commander, he carried on quietly, never mentioning the incident again. He didn't need to. His neighbors now saw him with new eyes, not only as the leader of their police but as a symbol of restraint, wisdom, and quiet courage. And while the street eventually returned to its everyday routines, the story remained etched into its history, told and retold as a reminder that truth always rises, and dignity always prevails. Weeks later, the neighborhood seemed to settle back into its usual rhythm, but beneath the surface, something had changed. People greeted one another with more care, more awareness, as though they were all silently remembering that afternoon. Conversations with the commander became more frequent, not about authority, but about community, how they could look out for one another, not through suspicion, but through kindness. It was as if the street itself had been given a second chance to define what it meant to be neighbors. The mother, however, felt the weight of that day every time she stepped outside. No one mocked her, no one spoke cruelly, but the silence around her carried a different truth. Respect could no longer be demanded, it had to be earned. Slowly, she began to soften. She started with small gestures, returning a neighbor's trash bin, offering a quiet hello, even encouraging her son to say thank you when once he never did. They weren't grand changes, but they were real, shaped by the sting of a lesson that had humbled them both. Her son, more than anyone, carried the memory with him. He often thought about the groceries, about the calm way the commander stood while everyone else held their breath. It was the first time he realized that strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it spoke softly, yet powerfully enough to change everything. That realization stayed with him, guiding him quietly toward the kind of person he hoped to become. Time moved on, but the lesson of that day kept echoing in ways no one had expected. The commander, though never boastful, became a quiet anchor for the neighborhood. His presence reminded everyone of balance, of fairness, and of how easily assumptions could lead to division. Yet what stood out most was not his authority, but his humility. He never once mentioned the incident again, treating the mother and her son with the same calm respect he gave to all. That silent grace spoke louder than any lecture. The boy, meanwhile, began to notice things he had overlooked before. He saw the kindness in neighbors who carried heavy bags for the elderly, the patience of those who took time to listen before speaking. Small things that once seemed invisible now held meaning. He found himself helping without being asked, and each act felt different, lighter, as though he was stepping away from the shadow of entitlement and into something brighter. Even his mother, though slower to change, began to see the truth. Pride had once ruled her, convincing her that control meant power. But after facing the reality of her mistake, she started to understand that control was nothing compared to respect. Though she would never admit it aloud, she found herself watching her son with quiet hope, realizing that his growth might be the clearest sign that she, too, was capable of change. The neighborhood, once defined by rules and complaints, now carried a softer rhythm, one rooted in dignity, humility, and the quiet strength of lessons learned. Months later, the incident had become a quiet story that every neighbor remembered, even if they rarely spoke about it aloud. It lingered in the air like an unspoken agreement, shaping the way people treated one another. The commander continued his life as he always had, but his influence was felt more deeply than ever. Neighbors who once avoided each other began to exchange smiles, small talks at mailboxes stretched longer, and a new sense of unity began to take root. It wasn't sudden, but it was steady, like the slow but certain growth of a tree. The boy, now a little older and a little wiser, often replayed the memory in his mind. He remembered how quickly his demands had spiraled into something so serious, and how the commander's calmness had stopped everything from collapsing. Those thoughts changed him. Where once he had shouted first and thought later, now he paused, considering the weight of his actions. It was a change his friends at school noticed too. He spoke less of what he deserved and more of what he could do. As for his mother, she walked a quieter path. Though her pride still tugged at her, she began to understand that authority was not the same as respect. She made small efforts, like listening before speaking and offering apologies where before there had only been excuses. And while she still struggled, her neighbors noticed. They saw the beginnings of change and, for the first time, began to accept her efforts instead of dismissing them. The street was slowly healing, and the echoes of that day had become the guide. Seasons changed, and with them, the neighborhood's spirit grew softer, warmer. What once was a place defined by sharp rules and watchful eyes had slowly become a space of cooperation. The lesson everyone witnessed months ago had not been forgotten. In fact, it had become a quiet reminder that dignity must be at the heart of every community. The commander never preached it, never forced it, he simply lived it, and that example carried more weight than any rulebook could. The boy, still young but no longer sheltered by blind entitlement, found himself gravitating toward that example. He began greeting the commander whenever their paths crossed, sometimes asking small questions about life, responsibility, or fairness. And though the conversations were short, they left deep impressions. Each word felt like a guiding star, shaping him in ways his mother never expected. For the first time, he wasn't just learning from mistakes, he was growing from wisdom freely given. His mother, too, felt the shift. She no longer walked with the same fiery arrogance that once set her apart. Instead, she carried herself with a cautious humility, knowing that every interaction left an impression. Though she rarely admitted her fault openly, she began showing it through actions, helping neighbors, apologizing when wrong, even praising her son when he chose kindness over pride. The road to respect was long, but each step brought her closer to the community she had once alienated. And in that growth, the entire neighborhood found a sense of healing. By now, the boy had grown used to seeing the commander not just as a neighbor, but as a quiet guide. Their interactions remained simple, an occasional wave, a kind word, a brief exchange while carrying groceries, but each moment carried weight. The boy began to notice how the commander treated people, never rushing to judgment, never raising his voice, always listening first. It was a kind of strength that didn't need to announce itself, and it fascinated him. Without realizing it, he started to mirror that calmness in his own life. At school, when conflicts arose, the boy no longer demanded to be right. Instead, he listened. He found that by staying calm, he often earned respect rather than fear. Teachers noticed, classmates noticed, even his mother noticed. She watched with a mix of surprise and relief as her son grew into someone she hadn't expected, someone kinder, more thoughtful, and less entitled. And though pride still tugged at her, she knew deep down that much of his growth came from the lesson neither of them could erase. The neighbors, too, began to look differently at the boy and his mother. Where once there had been whispers of disapproval, now there were nods of quiet encouragement. Small signs of trust returned, a shared smile, an invitation to help, the easing of tension that had once defined every interaction. The community, once fractured by one woman's pride, now found itself slowly woven together by the example of dignity and patience they had all witnessed. And at the center of that change stood the commander, still silent, still steady, still leading without ever needing to say he was in charge. One quiet evening, the neighborhood gathered for a small community event, something simple, a potluck in the park where families shared food and stories. It was the kind of gathering that once would have made the mother stand apart, watching for faults rather than joining in. But this time, she arrived with her son at her side, carrying a homemade dish she had spent hours preparing. It wasn't just food, it was her first real gesture of offering, of stepping toward the community she had once pushed away. At first, conversations were light, cautious, polite. But as laughter spread among the tables, the mother felt the weight of unspoken memories pressing in. She knew that many there still remembered the day she had called the police, still remembered the embarrassment that had unfolded in front of everyone. For a moment, she considered retreating, shrinking back into silence. Yet, looking at her son, now smiling as he helped serve food, she realized that hiding would undo the growth they had both fought for. Taking a deep breath, she stood a little taller and addressed the small circle of neighbors near her. Her voice trembled at first, but her words were clear. She didn't make excuses. She didn't dress it in pride. She simply said she had been wrong that day, that she had judged unfairly, spoken too quickly, and forgotten the respect every person deserved. The air grew still as her confession hung there, fragile yet powerful. And then, slowly, heads nodded. The silence broke not with judgment, but with acceptance. It wasn't forgiveness asked for, it was forgiveness given. The circle of neighbors grew quiet after the mother's words, the weight of her honesty settling gently across the gathering. For the first time, she hadn't tried to control the story, she hadn't tried to defend her pride, she had simply spoken the truth. Her son stood close, looking up at her with a mixture of surprise and admiration, as though seeing his mother in a new light. And just beyond the group, the commander, who had been listening in silence, finally stepped forward. All eyes turned to him. His presence carried the same calm authority as before, but this time there was something softer in it, something almost reassuring. He didn't raise his voice or make her confession heavier than it already was. Instead, he spoke with steady simplicity. "Growth begins when we face our mistakes," he said, his gaze moving from the mother to the neighbors gathered around. "It takes more strength to admit wrong than it does to pretend we were always right." The mother lowered her eyes, but there was no sting in his words, only a quiet dignity that lifted rather than crushed. Neighbors nodded, some even smiling faintly, as though a chapter long left open had finally been closed. The boy stood taller beside his mother, proud not of her perfection, but of her willingness to change. The commander didn't need to say more, his silence afterward was enough to let the moment settle. And in that silence, the neighborhood felt something shift once again, not judgment, not pride, but a shared respect that bound them closer than before.